Mr. Darcy's Bad Day, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. 1. Fitzwilliam Darcy was having a bad day, and as far as he was concerned, it was all Miss Elizabeth Bennet's fault. Stepping to the side of the path to avoid a rock the size of a small house, his right foot had slipped on clay soil hidden under a tuft of grass. His ankle had twisted, his left shoulder had crashed against the stone, and he was seated in a puddle of muddy water about 1 inch deep. Immediately he felt a throb radiating up his leg and a numbness in his toes. Cold water seeped through his gloved hands as he pressed down into the damp earth to leverage himself to stand. His bruised and battered shoulder protested. Adding insult to injury, his hat had fallen off, landing just out of reach. Perched precariously in a patch of weeds, he felt his expensive beaver topper represented his current situation. He was a rose among thorns, a diamond amidst glass. He was being ridiculous. Shaking the moisture and muck off the back of his greatcoat, he tentatively attempted to put weight on his throbbing ankle. Sucking in a breath, he stopped. He doubted it was broken. However, there was definitely damage to his appendage. Darcy looked back over his shoulder in hopes of spying someone approaching from Netherfield Park, the home of his good friend Charles Bingley. He could not even see the large manor house. Turning back, he looked ahead of him towards Longbourn, Miss Elizabeth's home. Surprised at how far he had travelled, he briefly appreciated the bucolic setting. An older estate, the stone exterior had aged well. Stately trees lined the drive, and bushy ivy surrounded the front doorway. The picture was welcoming to a wanderer. However, he knew it to be a facade. For inside the estate walls were 6 females of various shapes, appearances, and personalities. They were a noisy lot, led by a vulgar, fortune-hunting mother. All of them were a continual source of outrage, who offended his sense of decorum almost each time they opened their mouths. Well, with the possible exceptions of the 2 eldest daughters. Well beyond a shadow of a doubt, the firstborn and the one following were sensible creatures, so they should not be lumped in with the others. Darcy pondered. Possibly they were born to different parents and had come to live with the Bennets because they had been orphaned at an early age. Or perhaps they were the children of a distant nobleman who had been kidnapped by a band of thieves and traded to the Bennets for a leg of lamb and a jug of ale. He shook his head. He was becoming fanciful, and knew he needed to think clearly, or he would be wedged against this huge boulder until he grew old and grey, or perished. Unbidden, his mind went right back to the Bennets. It was the second eldest of the daughters who was solely responsible for his current predicament. Salient facts could not be ignored. Darcy's mare, Beatrice, whom he affectionately called Bee, had a slight limp when the groom had led her out of the stable that morning. Not wanting to miss the opportunity of vacating Bingley's premises, and avoiding the youngest of his host's sisters, Miss Caroline Bingley, Darcy had set out walking a path through the fields to the west. Miss Elizabeth Bennet seemed to find great pleasure in her rambles, so he determined to reach for the joy and peace she attained with her strolls. Stupid, foolish idea. Within a quarter of a mile, tall thistles had captured and clung to the inside fabric of his wool coat as it flared out behind him with each brisk step. After pulling himself loose, he adjusted his pace to keep his garment in place, slowing until he regained his normal quiet dignity as he moved across the field. A stile separating a field of harvested wheat from an unknown crop had proved to be rickety upon closer surveillance. Rather than risk life and limb, especially limb, he had attempted a vault over the fence, forgetting the length of fabric on his outer coat would be a hazard during his athletic leap. He had perched on top of that fence in a rather ungainly fashion, until he could unsnag himself and proceed. Thornton, his valet, kept his expensive leather hessians, polished so candlelight reflected in the smooth surface. Stepping off the fence, and into something left over from the north end of a southbound bovine, had put Darcy in a mood. Now, this. He could admit, without hesitation, that walking on 2 feet, rather than riding on 4, was not an improvement. His circumstances were dire, and it was all Miss Elizabeth's doing. Had she not made her strolls seem so beneficial, he never would have convinced himself to follow this course. Darcy would have returned to the breakfast-room to listen to Miss Caroline Bingley's constant criticism of the Bennet family and country life in general. Who could fault her on the former topic? The Bennets were... He growled. Had not Miss Elizabeth returned from each venture out of doors, with her skin showing a healthy flush, her eyes sparkling with merriment and joy, and strands of her lustrous locks gaining freedom and independence from restraint, the thought of meandering through the property would never have crossed his mind. Her glorious ambience filled the entryway as she entered Netherfield Park after a lengthy stroll. She was remarkable. She drew his eye like no other woman had done. Yes, it was 100% Miss Elizabeth who was responsible for his complaint. He looked to the sky for divine assistance, since no human seemed to be in close proximity, only to find the clouds had turned a darker hue, a much darker hue. They looked heavy, ponderous, ready to let down the... He felt the first drop. It landed on the bridge of his nose, directly between his eyes. Removing his now filthy gloves, he wiped it away, only to have it followed by 3 or 4 more, or 12, or 1,700. Bowing his head, he saw nothing for it. He would have to limp to Longbourn. Had he been an author of tragic Gothic novels, he would have thought Limp to Longbourn a fitting title for the sojourn ahead of him. Standing erect, gently placing his ailing foot on the ground, he shook the folds of his greatcoat so his appearance was intact. He looked at his hat with ferocious intensity, willing it to come to him on its own accord. It remained in place. He sighed, the air pouring from his lungs. He would have to fetch it himself. Aha! Unnoticed by him at first was a tree branch resting in the grass slightly behind his topper. He could use it as a crutch to stabilize and lighten the pressure on his ankle as he walked. Delicately, which he would never admit to in company, he navigated over and around the largest tufts of vegetation until he stood next to his goal. Without thinking, he bent and grabbed the hat first, doffing it in place. Then he bent for the piece of wood, losing his hat in the process. He was a dunce, a flaming dunderhead, a dolt. Looking around to make sure no one had noticed, he again reached for the hat. He was the victor. He had conquered both the hat and the crutch. Was there nothing his superior intellect and skills could not achieve? He thrust his fist into the air and shook it at the sky. He won this battle against the elements. The rain now bouncing off the brim, keeping his face dry. Then he turned back to the path. She was there, appearing from the foggy haze as if a vision. "Mr. Darcy, I can see you are unwell. Pray allow me to return to Longbourn for aid." She left. As quickly as she had come, she was gone. Was she a mere figment of his imagination? Had his desire for Miss Elizabeth's presence conjured her from thin air? How much of his activities had she witnessed? His face flamed at the thought. He abhorred any evidence of undignified behaviour. He was a Darcy. He shook his head at himself, realizing he had already done so once or twice since his fall. She discomposed him. She always had. Since the first night he set eyes on her at the assembly in Meryton, Miss Elizabeth had captured his attention in a way no other young lady had done. When she came to Netherfield Park to care for her sister, the days they were under the same roof together were sublime torture for him. Why? Because he knew beyond certainty on the day she and Miss Bennet departed Bingley's estate that she had infiltrated the depths of his soul. How could he, a Darcy, grandson of an earl, be twitterpated with a country miss of no consequence, with a mother and younger sisters who would be an embarrassment, and a father whose indolent character mocked his wife and daughter's proclivities. Rubbing his hands over his face, he almost dislodged his hat again. Carefully surveying his surroundings, he thought the better route would be to move to an area under an aged oak tree where the overhanging branches would protect him from the deluge. There he could await Miss Elizabeth's return. A brilliant flash of light shooting across the sky changed his mind. He deemed it far better to be wet than to fry. From his infancy, his father had taught him, "When thunder roars, go indoors." Glancing around quickly, he again noted there were no buildings visible other than Longbourn. He would not be able to remain where he was and wait for help. He would have to move. 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom! Thunder rumbled, travelling in the same pathway the lightning had done. A sense of panic rose in his chest. Another piece of shared wisdom from his father had been to stay away from wet items or areas during a lightning storm. He was probably holding more liquid in his wool coat than the creek flowing rapidly under the old oaks. Curious, there had been no creek there when he had last looked. Calming himself, or attempting to do so, he hunched his shoulders and leaned heavily on the crutch, wedging it into the ground until he felt it stable enough to bear his weight. He stepped forward. Victory! He took another step, then another. Focusing all his attention on the placement of the crutch, he failed to consider his slow progress over the pasture. What did it matter? He would be rescued when help returned. His slow pace was still progress, and he was extraordinarily proud of his minimal success. "Mr. Darcy!" A female voice yelled through the drumming rhythm of raindrops pounding on his hat and the ground. "Help is here!" He stood still and smiled. No happier words had he heard in a long time, though he would have been better pleased had she yelled 3 other words even more appealing. Again he shook his head. Had he hit his noggin when he landed against the boulder? What 3 words had he longed to hear? I like you. I love you. I want tea. I love warm blankets. No, that was 4 words, which would not do. As she ran closer, he noted her drenched bonnet and soaked clothing. She had never looked more lovely. Her arms were wrapped tightly around a thick quilt. Behind her was a pony and cart, a servant driving. Making a large circle in the field, the man brought the back of the rig alongside him. Darcy rolled his eyes. Mr. Bennet kept the most recalcitrant donkey on the face of the earth. When asked, Miss Elizabeth had laughed when she informed Darcy the animal's name was Benedick, the stubborn male lead from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Darcy had to agree. The donkey was appropriately named. Each time he rode through the fields close to Longbourn, that animal would attempt to ram his horse to run them off. Ears back, tail swishing nervously, he would bray his "ee-aw" from the time Darcy entered the area until he left. The driver held the restless donkey in place. They wanted out of the rain, and so did he. Miss Elizabeth tossed the blanket in the back as she moved to Darcy's good side. Holding his arm in both of her hands, she steadied him as he turned and slid backwards until his spine was up against the back of the seat. Shaking out the blanket, she covered as much of him as she could reach, patted him on his uninjured boot, and reassured him the apothecary had been called, and they would soon be at Longbourn. Lightning flashed across the sky, making the pony jump into action, and the cart bounce precariously. Rain crept through the blanket and between the folds of his coat, soaking his pants from just below his knees, where his boots ended, to mid-thigh. He was cold, achy, and miserable. It was only right that Miss Elizabeth had rescued him, and was cold and wet as well. Darcy saw no chance for improvement in the bad day he was having, and the sole burden of accountability belonged to none other than Miss Elizabeth Bennet. His lower lip caught a falling raindrop, and he pondered how the tenacious minuscule liquid particle had made it past the brim of his beaver. Only then did he comprehend that Fitzwilliam Darcy, Esquire, of Pemberley in Derbyshire and Darcy House in London, was pouting. Two. He was miserable. He had wiped his nose so often he feared it was shorter, or it would soon fall off his face altogether, leaving an unsightly void between his eyes and mouth. A porcupine had crawled down his throat and settled in uncomfortably with hundreds, or possibly thousands of quills, maybe millions. He was lying in the bowels of fiery Hades, and someone had rubbed sand in his eyes, so they lit on fire each time he blinked. Feeling diligence was far superior to comfort, he determined to remain alert, to determine who had caused him this latest calamity, though he guessed it was Miss Elizabeth who supplied the grit. "Mr. Darcy, sir?" A male voice spoke into the afternoon light, filtering through the window. He knew that voice. Thornton, his valet. Oh, thank heavens! A sensible male person was on the premises. He refused to call Mr. Bennet sensible, as what man would choose to have 5 daughters? Relief filled him, causing him to collapse back onto the pillow. He sniffed, in spite of his congestion. Lavender. Pressing his eyelids shut, ignoring the shards of granite scratching his pupils, he recalled the many times he had stood close to her, listening to her witty conversations and delighting in her mannerisms. Miss Elizabeth smelled like lavender, and sunshine, and heaven, and spring flowers, and like his favourite dreams from his childhood. His eyes shot open. Was he in Miss Elizabeth's bedchamber? Scrutinising his surroundings, he found further clues that he might be temporarily inhabiting her personal space. Plutarch's Parallel Lives in Greek was stacked on top of a thin volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, and A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. He smiled involuntarily at the last. Make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives. That is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. His father had gifted his mother a copy of this book when it was first released, and the volume rested in a place of honour on an eye-level shelf in Pemberley's library, copious notes filling the columns in his mother's hand. He imagined Miss Elizabeth would raise her brows if she knew he had read the book, several times, in fact. The walls were painted a pale yellow, with flashes of dark blue everywhere. The curtains on each side of a tall window were long stripes of midnight blue and white. Daylight and night. He could not help but wonder if she had chosen the décor. His own chambers at Pemberley, and his London house, had walls and fabrics in various shades of blue. This was another item he and Miss Elizabeth had in common. They both kept the colours of the sky surrounding them always. Surely this was her room. "Where am I?" He looked around the bedchamber, asking to see if his surmising had reached the proper conclusion. Thornton raised his brow, almost mirroring the move he had often witnessed Miss Elizabeth doing. "You do not know where you are, sir? Of course, I am aware we are at Longbourn." Darcy endeavoured to keep the frustration from his voice. "I'm merely curious as to who has been cast out of their chambers because of my unanticipated residence." "Miss Elizabeth, sir." He expelled air he was unaware he had been holding. It should not have been important, but it was. Had he been placed into Miss Lydia's room, he shuddered, or even Miss Mary's chambers, he would have had to ask to be relocated. He could not stay in the room of a young female he found irresponsible or pedantic. Darcy wanted to laugh at the thought. In all his 27 years, he had never been inside the bedchamber of a woman other than his mother's. He was an oddity amongst his peers, and was proud of his reputation. His former friend, George Wickham, had made up for Darcy's moral purity. From their university days, Darcy had had to clean up the messes left behind when Wickham abandoned the young females with hearts crushed, who were often with child. Rake. Was there not a guest room available? He was puzzled, his mind flitting randomly from one thought to the other. Longbourn was not nearly the size of Pemberley or Netherfield Park, but it was still a fairly substantial estate. No, there was not, Thornton replied. A cousin of Mr. Bennet has recently taken up residence, and the other extra rooms are, apparently, in a constant state of refurbishment by Mrs. Bennet. She is, as I was told when I was below stairs, uncertain as to whether Greek revival or the Egyptian theme is the current fashion in the first circles. Thornton blandly reported. Per cook, this situation has existed for almost 6 years, so the staff does not see the guest quarters becoming available in the near future. Have I been here long? Thornton continued to fold what looked to be white cotton cloths into a pile on top of a dressing table next to the only door in the room. It has been several hours since the apothecary left. There was a small amount of laudanum mixed with your tea, sir. Has it helped with the pain? What pain? He changed his position. His right ankle made its presence known. He found the pain. Memories of the effort it took to get from the pony cart upstairs to the bedroom flashed back to mind, and he grimaced. He was a large man, tall in size, with heavy arm muscles and broad shoulders developed from working the land. His thighs were massive from hours and hours upon horseflesh almost daily since his youth. He had been a cumbersome burden to the grooms, and who he assumed was Mr. Bennet's man. The master of the house had not deemed the situation worthy of his personal involvement. Darcy shook his head at the slight. No matter. It was not Mr. Bennet who held his attention. The indignity of his arrival had embarrassed him, and he vowed never to be put in such a position in the future, if it could at all be helped. Had he only chosen to wait for his mare, he would not be lying abed at Longbourn. Lying in Miss Elizabeth's bed. He smiled, inappropriately. What of Miss Elizabeth? His presence had thrust her from her personal area. He felt guilt, then solace. Nesting down in her bed was like having her arms wrapped around him, soothing him. He was again being ridiculous. She's with Miss Bennet. Ah, I am not surprised. Yes, the two eldest, according to the staff, are the closest of sisters, and are admired by the whole of the servants, and Miss Elizabeth in particular. Why, you are a fount of information, Thornton. I try, sir. Why has Miss Elizabeth been singled out? Did they clarify? His curiosity knew no bounds. They reported on her unfailing kindness to the tenant families when they are in need. Miss Elizabeth endeavours to ease matters when her mother becomes overwrought, and her demands are more than what the servants typically bear. The housekeeper praises the young Miss's efforts to instruct her younger sisters on proper decorum, and cook claims this particular gentleman's daughter has tree climbing to a fine art. She is able to quickly return with a basket of the best apples for her father's favourite fruit tarts. Thank you, Thornton, Darcy mumbled, adding each detail to what he already knew and liked about Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The information is helpful. As much as it was Thornton's position to respect his master, Darcy, unusually for one of his status, held his valet in high esteem. Rarely did the older man display emotion. Rarely did he express an opinion, though, when asked, his replies displayed an inherent intelligence Darcy cherished. Curiosity planted itself behind him, dug in its heels, and was forcefully nudging him to ask, Was this all you learned about the Bennets? Truly, he cared not about anyone other than the second eldest child, but did not want to expose his feelings when he was in complete denial of having any emotional ties to her. And he was comfortable in his denial, thank you very much. It was reported downstairs that the youngest had much rather have had an officer staying at Longbourn than either you or her father's cousin. Miss Kitty seconded her opinion. Thornton stood as still as a statue, keeping his eyes focused somewhere on the wall behind the bed, his countenance similar to a first-year student reciting the alphabet to his schoolmaster. The next in line, Miss Mary, according to the housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, who is not above gossiping, expressed a decided lack of faith in the Almighty as the reason for your injury. Both men rolled their eyes. Miss Jane Bennet has not ceased fretting over the pain you are suffering. Mrs. Bennet claims it is more challenging to have one man in ill health than all 5 of her daughters at once, and the rector, Mr. Bennet's cousin, has been trying to personally offer you guidance and counsel from God's word by knocking at the door every 30 minutes to request the favour of attending you. I am now able to accurately tell the passage of time by his petitions. Mr. Bennet has not left his book-room since my arrival, and, I am led to believe, since your arrival as well. Darcy hesitated. Has Miss Elizabeth spoken of my injury? His breath caught in his sore throat as he awaited Thornton's reply. She has not. Disappointment hit him hard and fast. However, Thornton quickly added, to Darcy's intense relief, Miss Elizabeth has had no need to inquire, as she has personally seen to every aspect of your care, and mine. 3 short taps sounded on the outside of the door. Completely forgetting everything his valet had told him, with the exception of the young lady of interest seeing to his needs, he called out, Enter. Mr. William Collins, rector of Hunsford Parish, and cousin of his host, Mr. Bennet, stepped through the door. It took less than 10 seconds for Darcy to wish him banished from his room to a far-flung region in Tibet. No, Tibet was a place he had a budding interest in visiting. It would not do. One of the penal colonies of Australia. He shook off the thought as the man continued his nasal ramblings. The tiger-infested jungles of remnants of laudanum-induced confusion blotted his thinking, and he could not seem to recall where there were man-eating tigers. India. The man needed one-way passage on the next steamer leaving England. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Darcy caught the name. My aunt? How do you know my aunt? Your aunt? The younger man with greasy hair and a bulbous nose was flabbergasted. You are related to the most elegant, most refined exemplar of the highest echelons of society? No, I'm not, Darcy scoffed. His aunt embodied none of those characteristics. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is my mother's sister. Who might you be? I am Mr. William Collins, at your service. He bowed. Since you are nephew to my esteemed patroness, and are not in uniform, I take it you are Mr. Darcy of Pemberley. I doubt the Viscount would be in this humble area of England. Darcy chose not to address the location of his Fitzwilliam cousins with the clergyman. They had not been properly introduced, and he felt he owed the man nothing. He was offended by his unwanted guest's lack of hygiene. Did he not understand? God created water on the first, or maybe it was the second, or possibly the third creative day, so Adam could have a bath soon after he was formed from the dust. I currently hold the living at Hunsford, under the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She has tasked me with selecting a wife from one of my cousin's daughters. The man clasped his lapels and rocked up on his toes. Did he think it improved his stature? It did not. You see, this estate is entailed to the male line. Since Mrs. Bennet saw fit to produce mere females, the inheritance will fall to me. Lady Catherine clearly expressed the opinion that offering an olive branch by marrying a Bennet girl will ease the frantic concern Mr. Bennet has over his family's future, once he dies, of course. Of course, Darcy whispered, processing the information. He was confident Mrs. Bennet had not chosen to have only female children, and it was she, not her husband, who was the one frantically searching for marriage mates with enough blunt to support her and the daughters remaining at home, should something untoward happen to her spouse. According to rumour, for he did not know whether this was truth or not, Mr. Bennet appeared to be entirely unconcerned about anything other than his books. While his mind wandered, the parson continued his discourse. Darcy ignored him for the most part. "Miss Elizabeth—" "What?" Darcy demanded. How dare the man speak of the second eldest Bennet daughter in the same conversation as Lady Catherine? Or marriage? "I am sorry. Pardon me. Were you not attending?" The man did that rocking thing again. "I have determined none other than Miss Elizabeth Bennet will be the beneficiary of my humble home, my affections, and the source of happiness of my future life. Sir," he added, "it was almost love at first sight." "Almost?" Darcy hissed. "Certainly. An intelligent man such as yourself should not be surprised when my interest first fell to Miss Bennet. Her classic beauty and her quiet demeanour would have added to my standing in the parish. When Mrs. Bennet claimed her eldest was soon to be engaged, my attention turned to the second daughter. For the purpose of peace between the Bennet family and me, I thought I would lower my sights to Miss Elizabeth." Added to the runny nose, scratchy throat, fever, and itchy, watery eyes, Darcy now had steam coming from his ears. "Settle! Lower your sights!" Anger filled him from his head to his toes. "You think to settle by choosing Miss Elizabeth," he huffed. "You ignorant, sycophant buffoon!" III. Within seconds of his proclamation, there was another tap on his door. Growling at Mr. Collins, he did not change his tone when he bade whoever was attempting to invade his presence to enter. Instantly he was apologetic. Miss Elizabeth refused to look at him as she stood in the open doorway. She had changed from her wet clothes and wore a day dress of pale blue. He believed it was now his favourite colour. Her hair had been restyled, and she looked as fresh as the summer sunshine and as desirable as a new foal. Rather than peering at him, she gave her full attention to the man attempting to hover over his bed, or rather her bed. Darcy wondered at the rector when he appeared to ignore Miss Elizabeth's presence, the fire shooting from her lovely eyes, and her hands planted firmly on her hips. Darcy was aware he did not know that much about women, but he had seen that stance when his mother was irritated at his father, and her ire was well deserved. It was an expression deserving of notice by every man. The rector failed to see the obvious. "Mr. Collins, I believe you are needed elsewhere." Miss Elizabeth's tone was crisp. "Miss Elizabeth!" The rector's voice was raised. "How could you not have informed me that the man betrothed to the daughter of my patroness was staying in my future home?" "Betrothed?" Miss Elizabeth whispered as she glanced at Darcy. Mr. Collins balled his fists and stomped towards the young woman. "Your oversight has placed me in an uncomfortable position." How dare a man intimidate a female? It was not done. Darcy was horrified at the oaf's demeanour as he approached Miss Elizabeth. Acting on impulse, he jumped out of bed to offer his protection. He was fine throwing back the bedclothes and sitting up from the pillows. It was when Darcy placed his stockinged feet on the floor and stood upright that his world suddenly tilted off its axis. The imbecilic parson was far slower to respond than the nimble Miss Elizabeth. She ran to Darcy's side, wrapping her arms around his chest, while leaning into him to bear his weight and keep him from falling to the hardwood floor. He hissed as pain radiated up his leg, instantly throbbing like the worst headache known to mankind. To steady himself, or at least that was how he would explain himself later, he hugged her tightly to him until he could balance unassisted on his uninjured leg. Lavender. Momentarily closing his eyes, the scratchy, gritty feeling evaporated like the morning mist. The porcupine leapt from his throat, and his nose returned to the size he had been wearing since adolescence. He felt amazing as he relished the feel of her slight form in his embrace. The pounding of his heart found its way to his inner ears, so he did not at first hear the screeching coming from the hallway outside of the open door of the bedchamber. Miss Elizabeth heard. She pulled her head back and looked him directly in the eye. "This does not look good, Mr. Darcy. Perhaps I should have let you fall." She smirked, though it did not reach her eyes. Darcy looked behind her to see a red-faced Mr. Collins standing beside an equally excitable Mrs. Bennet, whose index finger was pointing directly at him. "Compromise!" the matron yelled, as if Longbourn was a home for the hard of hearing, or she was the archangel coming to call the dead from their graves. "You, sir, have need to speak immediately to Mr. Bennet to arrange marriage to my Lizzie. Act the gentleman, and do it now." He was far more offended at her claim he was not presenting himself as a gentleman than her charge to marry Miss Elizabeth. He had been raised by a family who oozed gentlemanliness from their pores. How dare she? In his ire, he pulled Miss Elizabeth tighter into his chest. Lavender. Ignoring the clergyman, Mrs. Bennet stepped closer. It was not until she was almost standing next to Darcy before his mind cleared of the scent, and his brain began to function. Surely Miss Elizabeth's mother should have demanded he release her daughter, but she had not. Curious. Surely Miss Elizabeth should have immediately insisted on being released, but she did not. Or, wait a moment. Disregarding the presence of Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Collins, and Thornton, he gave his attention entirely to the young woman in his arms. She was not looking at him. In fact, her efforts appeared to focus solely on the need to keep him upright and stable, rather than the inner turmoil he was feeling. How distressingly mortifying. Was she not secretly pleased to be held so close? He was pleased. Was she not hoping, after the weeks of attention from the highest-ranking single man to visit their portion of Hertfordshire in decades, that he would finally declare himself? He was hoping. He squeezed tighter, wishing she would look at him. She did not, as she continued to adjust her weight to support him. For a certainty, Miss Elizabeth had to realize what an honour it would be to have her name connected with his. Certainly. He squeezed again, and again she shifted her weight. Since he reached his majority, there had not been one mother with maiden daughters who had not sought his attention as a future son-in-law. Their offspring had followed like sheep to the bidding of their parent. None had balked. Why should Miss Elizabeth? He huffed scornfully. Of course she would be pleased. She read Plutarch. She was intelligent enough to comprehend the benefits to her and her family by becoming a Darcy. When Mrs. Bennet again started speaking, it became apparent that her overriding motivation was not anger, but glee. 10,000 a year! Well done, Lizzie! Think of the pin money, the carriages, the jewels. Her beefy hands rubbed together as her eyes glazed over. I need to share my joy with Lady Lucas and Mrs. Phillips. They will be pleased with my success. Mamma! Miss Elizabeth dropped her arms and stepped back, though she kept her hand firmly fastened on Darcy's upper arm to give him support. Pray, hush. You have not witnessed a compromise. Mr. Darcy could have added to his injuries had he fallen. My assistance was only to keep him from coming to further harm. It would not do for the neighbours to know he worsened while at Longbourn, would it? Her efforts failed to reach beyond Mrs. Bennet's own conclusions. Mr. Collins decided it was sensible to add his opinion. He was blatantly incorrect of what constituted good sense. "Mrs. Bennet, you are mistaken." He moved closer to where the three were standing. "Mr. Darcy cannot be forced to wed your daughter, as he is already betrothed to the finest jewel in all of England. Lady Catherine de Bourgh will not accept your efforts to distract him from her goal." "Lady Catherine de Bourgh? Who is she to me?" Mrs. Bennet huffed. "Besides, Miss Elizabeth is to be my wife." The look the dolt gave Miss Elizabeth was pointed as he lifted his chin and squinted his eyes. "Her current display proves she needs a strong hand to temper her impulsiveness." He reached to grab her arm. "I will see she learns the value of a submissive wife. Do not worry." Enraged, Darcy pulled Miss Elizabeth away from Mr. Collins and tucked her in beside him, clasping her hand as he did so. She tried to shake him off, but he would not budge. How had his day come to this? All he had wanted to do was ride his horse, avoid Caroline Bingley's efforts to manipulate him into a marriage he did not want, and ponder his future as master of Pemberley. Now he was injured, wanting to beat another human being into a pulp, and engaged to marry the one woman who had stirred his interest. Apparently, Miss Elizabeth Bennet had had enough. She pushed Darcy hard enough he lost his balance, and sat back so heavily on her mattress that he bounced. Then she turned to address Mr. Collins. She was magnificent. "Sir, you assume far too much." She did the same finger-poking thing her mother had just done. Had she actually jabbed Mr. Collins' chest, it would have hurt even through the layers of clothing. Darcy refused to feel sorry for him. "You have not offered for me, nor have I given you an answer. None the less, to save you the trouble, I would not marry you if you were the last man on earth. Any man who thinks physical dominance is appealing to a female is a fool, and you, Mr. Collins, are a fool." She turned to her mother, her hands fisted at her hips, face flushed, chin lifted, and her eyes flaming. "You are seeing what is not reality, Mamma." Her voice softened, though her words were clear. "As stated before, there has been no compromise. Mr. Darcy needed assistance. Had you been inside the room, you would have rushed to do the same. I know this of you. Your care and attention to guests in our home is unparalleled in all of Hertfordshire. Why, not even Mr. Bingley's sisters offered the level of hospitality I know you routinely provide." Mrs. Bennet preened under the praise. Darcy shuddered involuntarily at the thought of being clasped to Mrs. Bennet's ample bosom. Why had Miss Elizabeth suggested something so horrifying? He barely kept from shuddering. "Pray, do not force Mr. Darcy's hand." Miss Elizabeth's voice was so soft that Darcy had to lean forward to hear. "He is destined for greater connections than we have to offer, Mamma. His affections are attached to Mr. Bourgh. To attempt to steal him away would be the mark of an inferior woman, and while you seek the best interests of your children, you are not the type of person to put your desires above those of others." Darcy had to admit it was a valiant effort. Did Miss Elizabeth actually believe what she was saying? Mrs. Bennet appeared to rethink her demands as her daughter's words flowed over her soul like cooling water on a warm day. Then she shook her head briskly. "No, no, you will not distract me. I have decided, and will not change my mind." Mrs. Bennet's grin looked positively evil. "Since Mr. Darcy cannot easily manoeuvre downstairs to visit your father, I shall send him up." She clapped her hands and squealed, sounding like a sow giving birth to a litter of overweight piglets. "One daughter married and soon another engaged. How can I bear being so happy?" Spinning, she vacated the room as quickly as she had entered, a whirling dervish, leaving a path of devastation behind. "Mr. Darcy!" Both Miss Elizabeth and Mr. Collins spoke at the same time. He had no doubts as to his response. Standing carefully, grabbing at the crutch he had not noticed before leaning against the bed's headboard, he looked at the clergyman.
"Mr. Collins, I cannot imagine Lady Catherine being aware of your propensity to violence."
The rector sputtered. He cautiously took a step closer to the man.
"Have no doubt that I will share your conduct towards Miss Elizabeth with Lady Catherine. At the same time I share the news of my betrothal to your cousin, not mine."
Standing over the much shorter clergyman, he fisted his hand, in the same manner the oath had done to Miss Elizabeth, shaking it in his face.
"You will not touch Miss Elizabeth," he growled. "You will not look at her. You will not speak to her."
Each word was articulated plainly, his voice gaining in volume with each syllable.
"Do you understand?"
"Yes, sir," came the immediate reply, whereupon the oath bowed to him at least 3 times before begging leave from Darcy's presence. Mr. Collins ignored Miss Elizabeth as he departed the room. Darcy forgot about him as soon as he turned back to her, his eyes now focused intensely on the woman next to him. She had captured his attention early on in their acquaintance, and had kept it solidly fixed on her. He now understood it had not been done by design. Nevertheless, she had it anyway. He was not displeased with the current circumstances. There was much he admired about Miss Elizabeth Bennet. She was not mercenary, or she would have been as quick as her mother to insist on a marriage between them. She was well read, conversant with subjects interesting to him, calm under pressure, efficient when needed, and polite to her elders, even when they were vulgarly wrong. The rector's claims that Darcy was to marry his cousin, Anne de Bourgh, were the wishes of Lady Catherine, not him or Anne. They had little in common, and held no affection other than what was common among family members. She had no desire to take on the task of mistress of Pemberley, or wife to Fitzwilliam Darcy. He had no desire to... well, he could not even begin to contemplate a physical relationship with his frail cousin.
Miss Elizabeth? Oh, yes. He had no trouble contemplating...
He could feel his face getting red.
Miss Elizabeth,
Darcy started, though immediately wondered where his tongue was leading him, as his brain had nothing to offer in the way of wise words, charmingly stated utterances, or sublime conversation. Even without his embarrassment at his wayward imaginings, he had never been gifted as a conversationalist. "Yes, Mr. Darcy?" Her left brow raised, just as he had known it would. He smiled, hoping she would ignore the fact that his hair was undoubtedly standing up at odd angles from the pillow. Her pillow. Lavender. I thank you for rescuing me, and for again coming to my aid." He wanted to slap himself in the forehead. That was all that came to mind. "You are welcome." He heard her hesitation. His closest friends, Charles Bingley and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam, would not have been surprised at him desiring to get directly to the point. Once he decided upon a pathway, he pursued his goal with single-mindedness.
"Marry me?"
"4. Mr. Darcy, pray speak to my father before asking for an answer. He is a reasonable man who cares for the happiness of his daughters." She sat in the chair next to the bed, ostensibly to await the presence of the man in question, while he attempted to do the same on the edge of the bed, with as much grace as possible. In truth, not much was possible. Miss Elizabeth looked to his valet. "Sir, would you assist Mr. Darcy to find comfort? These past few minutes cannot have helped his injuries." Then she quietly waited until Thornton had done as bid. "I thank you, and I'm sure Mr. Darcy does as well." With that, she again looked to the man who had been the cause of her removal from her own chambers, her head tilted and her eyes wide.
"I cannot imagine a responsible father not insisting a marriage take place."
Darcy felt the need to tread cautiously.
"Miss Elizabeth, can you not see the possibilities?"
She lifted her chin. "So you say."
"And you do not?"
He was starting to get irritated. Having his ankle in a constant throb was not helping the situation. "Sir, if I wanted to marry to improve my family's circumstances, I would have accepted Mr. Collins when he eventually offered. He is the heir to Longbourn. As his wife, I could see my sisters and mother remain in our home, if needed." She hissed out a breath. "I refused his claim for the same reason I will refuse yours. I feel no more affection or respect for you as I do my father's cousin."
"Those are harsh words you might wish to rethink before your father walks through that door."
He pointed to the opening to the hallway with his chin. "Why are you pushing for this, Mr. Darcy? You do not find me attractive. You have shown disdain to all I know and love. You can barely tolerate my company, and look to find fault, which I am certain you are able to do with success." Miss Elizabeth raised both hands, palms up, with her shoulders lifted. She looked to his valet. "By chance, did Mr. Darcy hit his head when he fell?"
"There is nothing wrong with my head or my thinking, Miss Elizabeth. I am sensible of what I asked of you. I also am sensible of what your mother and that toad, Mr. Collins, witnessed when you attempted to break my fall. For a certainty, many marriages have happened because of far less physical contact. We were—"
He coughed.
"We were pressed against each other from our shoulders to our toes."
"We were not," she stubbornly insisted. "My shoulders are several inches below yours, to be exact. Do not exaggerate the situation, for I do not appreciate it at all."
"You are splitting hairs, my lady."
He insisted, a feeling of desperation filling his chest.
What if Mr. Bennet did not insist on a marriage? What would he do then?
"Yes, I am." Boldly, she looked him straight in the eye. Her comment put him off balance, as it was the last thing he expected.
"You do not fight fair."
He delighted knowing she would keep him off kilter. He could easily perceive a future far less dull than the marriages of most of his friends and acquaintances. "Do you waltz, Mr. Darcy?" He shook his head, discerning he had no clue how her mind had travelled from the dividing of the tresses on her head to dancing.
"I do."
He was burning with curiosity, though he still felt the sting of her comment that she had no affection or respect for him. Lumping him in with that imbecile had been an insult. He was Fitzwilliam Darcy, not some ignorant nincompoop.
"Why do you ask?"
"How can you tell if a dancer has never danced the waltz before?"
"Good. An easy question." "They stumble and do not move in concert with their partner."
"As a practised observer, is it a pleasing sight?"
Had she watched him watching others? "No, it is difficult to see."
"Do you believe it any more pleasant when you see a husband and wife continually pushing and pulling against each other, moving out of harmony? For I cannot imagine anything more unsightly." He understood. He had yet to see Mr. and Mrs. Bennet together at a social event. He had never seen them in a room together. Miss Elizabeth's mother was loud, while her husband closeted himself away in his book-room. He did not blame the man. Neither could he blame Miss Elizabeth. To a young woman of discernment, she would long for a different sort of match, where peaceful harmony would be the order of the day.
"I comprehend the metaphor."
He paused, pondering how he should make his point.
"However, how is a couple to learn the moves unless they practice?"
"Mr. Darcy, I will not belabour the matter." She leaned towards him. You cannot truly wish this. A deep voice from the doorway interrupted.
Whether he wishes this or not, Lizzie dear, it appears you are engaged to marry, for your mother and my cousin have both invaded my lair with reports of a most scandalous nature.
Papa! Miss Elizabeth pleaded with the man, her eyes limpid pools of distress. Do not make me do this, I pray you. She stood and walked to him as he entered, clasping his left hand with both of hers. I do not love him. Mr. Bennet patted her shoulder with his free hand.
I know, my daughter.
He sighed, and Darcy felt victorious. Miss Elizabeth's father would support his petition. His relief was immense. Thornton provided a chair, placing it next to Miss Elizabeth. As soon as her father sat, he began again.
I have no doubt of your innocence, and have pieced together the events as they most likely happened.
Mr. Bennet reassured them both.
Nonetheless, your mother has already requested the carriage, and is off to spread the tale.
Did you not tell her to keep silent? Did you keep the carriage from her? Miss Elizabeth begged with her words, and her pained expression, for her sensible parent to provide reassurance.
You know as well as I, Lizzie, that your mother will do as she wishes.
But, Elizabeth pleaded. Darcy could feel her frustration, even though her father appeared to ignore his beloved daughter's concerns.
No, Lizzie, your mother will not stop speaking of this until she has satisfied herself that her friends will envy her the match.
He chuckled, and Darcy was immediately angered. There was nothing humorous when belittling the concerns of his intended.
Mr. Bennet.
Darcy bluntly caught the man's attention.
You had a choice the minute your wife and cousin began speaking of something so inappropriate, something with the power to ruin the reputations of each one of your children. Your failure to act, to use your authority as husband and head of this household, has placed the daughter who I have heard referred to as your favourite in a position against her wishes and her very nature.
Mr. Bennet looked out from under his bushy eyebrows with a steady gaze. He seemed unfazed by Darcy's criticism. His response proved this to be the truth.
You are undoubtedly correct, Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Bennet crossed one leg over the other and leaned back in the chair, his posture seeming relaxed and unaffected.
Nonetheless, you are not married to Mrs. Bennet. I am. It happens that Mr. Collins is the rector of a living held by my Aunt Catherine,
Darcy stated with clarity.
I have no doubts he is penning a missive which will bring her running to your door in an effort to overthrow your wife's desires. She is unused to being denied. This engagement will be unacceptable to her. She will challenge your authority to make this happen, and your wife's gossip as being the stuff of lies. I have no doubt you and your family will suffer grievously because of her interference. Then I expect you to stop her, Mr. Bennet replied. As you stopped Mrs. Bennet, Darcy snapped back. You are quick, my boy. I am not a boy, Mr. Bennet, and have not been for a long time, Darcy hissed. You may find fault with my discomfort in the company of strangers, and in speaking without thought on occasion, but you will never fault me for caring diligently for my responsibilities. Should Miss Elizabeth and I find ourselves married, I will care for her, protecting her with everything I possess. She will never worry that I would abandon her to scorn or censure, for I have no doubt we will partner in making decisions for our family, so we have peace and contentment rule our home.
His voice rose.
Never would I abdicate my authority to make her an object of ridicule, for a wife reflects the quality of man she marries. I will spend my lifetime striving to make her proud to be married to me.
Mr. Bennet clapped, and Darcy's ire grew exponentially.
Well said, Mr. Darcy.
He turned to his daughter, lifting his brow.
Your young man is able to speak well when he chooses. This should give you reason to believe your home will not remain silent as a tomb.
He stood and moved behind the chair, not making eye contact with Miss Elizabeth, or offering reassurance in any form. Instead, he stared at Darcy.
You are a guest in my home, one who is not here by invitation. You openly condemn my marriage and the care of my household. You have managed in one afternoon to compromise my most precious child, tying yourself to this same household. Despite these insults, you are seeking my consent and blessing to this union. Am I correct? You are.
He knew what he wanted, more than he had that morning. He would take Elizabeth Bennet from this zoo to a home where she would be treated with dignity. If she had not yet reached her majority, it was Mr. Bennet's consent or Gretna Green. At that moment in time, either would do for him.
I am astounded at your arrogance.
Mr. Bennet shook his head.
Lizzie, you've been unusually quiet. Do you have anything to add?
Her father finally looked at his daughter. Darcy did as well. I have much to say, Papa. Are you willing to listen?
Elizabeth, I have been married to a woman I did not love for almost 1/4 of a century. Has it been worth it?
His question was rhetorical.
Absolutely. I would not have had you to adore for the last 20 years had I not wed your mother. Every day I choose to be contented with the few joys I have, rather than the many miseries. You and I are of a similar nature, Lizzie. I doubt it will take much for you to see beyond his offensiveness to the benefits of marriage to this man. Therefore, no, I do not need to listen to your complaints or comments, my daughter.
With those few words, he dismissed Miss Elizabeth, crushing her heart in the process. Mr. Bennet walked to the doorway. Turning back, he said,
The bishop is visiting our shire. He's a favoured chess opponent and frequent guest. I will send for him, so you can purchase a special licence. You will marry on the morrow.
He left the room in stunned silence. Darcy had never witnessed disappointment on Miss Elizabeth's face. She was rarely seen without a kind smile. This hurt his heart to see her pained. A tear trickled down her cheek. He thought to reassure her.
I will attempt to be a good husband.
She sobbed, burying her face in her hands.
Could this day get any worse?
"5. In his almost 28 years, Fitzwilliam Darcy had rarely felt sorry for himself. He had mourned the loss of each of his beloved parents, lamented the necessity to leave his home and cherished little sister, to live away from his family at Eton and Cambridge, and suffered the traitorous deeds of his former friend. Each event, though causing intense anguish, had moulded him, strengthened him into a man his parents would have been proud of. Of this fact he had no doubt. Her reaction to his proposal was far harder to sort through. For the second time that day, he felt the urge to pout. This was personal, not a response to an unforeseen situation outside of his control. Miss Elizabeth's rejection was a direct reaction to his conduct over the 6 weeks he had been in Hertfordshire. He felt very, very sorry for the perceived injustice done to him. Yet she was right. To his shame, he was undeserving. Although it was his inclination, excusing himself and trying to reason her out of her attitude was wrong, for how could he ever find words to justify his own offensive actions towards her and the people she loved, her neighbours and friends? The weight of his sins settled upon him, and he felt rotten to the core. How dare he criticise Mr. Bennet? The older man had been correct to call him out for his treatment of Mr. Bennet's favourite daughter. Had a potential suitor for his own sister acted similarly, Darcy would have given him the cut, forever alienating the miscreant from polite society, after giving him a good thrashing. He spoke softly, hoping she could hear him through her sorrow. I am responsible. This is my error. He looked to the opposite corner of the room, and found Thornton with his back turned to them, offering them a measure of privacy, while chaperoning them for propriety's sake. Darcy cared not if the man heard him humble himself. Taking a deep breath, he expelled it, then continued,
"You deserve a man of integrity, who loves you with his whole heart, soul, mind, and strength."
He looked at her bowed head, and hated himself for making her think she was beneath his notice at the assembly, and while she was at Bingley's estate. In truth, it was he who did not deserve her.
"You asked if I knew how to waltz, and I confidently gave you the impression I am a proficient."
He scoffed at himself, leaned his head back against the headboard, and looked up to the ceiling.
"I will now confess to you that I reek of inexperience. Masters have shown me the steps, for I had the stellar example of my parents' own marriage to follow. Yet, somehow, I lost my way."
He wiped his hand over his face, feeling the torment of the moment. Darcy again settled his gaze on her. This time her eyes were focused on him. Red-rimmed and puffy, they were still glorious in his sight.
"You have little reason to believe me when I tell you I am sincere in wanting you as my wife."
Immediately her hands grabbed the arms of the chair, and she leaned forward. "Then you are a fool, as much as my father's cousin. You do not know me if you think I can be insulted, then jump to accept an offer that was being forced upon us." She shot back at him. "I do not believe in fairy tales, Mr. Darcy. I have seen a marriage between two people equal in commitment to the happiness of the other, a marriage which gives evidence of phenomenal growth every time I am in company with the couple, a marriage that has withstood adversity and achieved matchless joy where both the husband and wife are blissful. Their children have every reason for happiness because both parents are equally devoted to their needs. When I am in their household, my senses relax, and I am at ease. Tension is absent because my aunt and uncle will, neither of them, allow the sun to set without settling any differences which might have cropped up." She stood and walked to the back of her chair, like her father had done moments before. "We have little in common, sir. We have been raised so differently, I have no doubt we would continue to struggle to find our place in a marriage. I refuse to live a life separate from my mate. I refuse to be treated less than he is because I was born a female. I refuse to attach myself to a man I do not respect and who does not respect me. You, Mr. Darcy, should expect the same."
"And you believe I could never become that man?"
He had to ask. His heart was thumping so rapidly and loudly, he feared she could hear. It felt like it would jump out of his chest at any moment. He breathed deeply to calm himself. He could not recall a time when he was as anxious. "I believe you do not know how to become that kind of man," she barked back at him. "Your arrogance, your selfish disdain for the feelings of others, my own included, has convinced me of your unsuitability to make me happy. I am confident I could never make you happy as well." His mood instantly changed. Anger oozed from his pores. How dare she judge him?
"My intention is not to be harsh, Miss Elizabeth, but are you saying you have no ability to forgive, no desire to overlook a grievous error, even if made unintentionally?"
He could no longer lie in her bed. It no longer held comfort. Grabbing the crutch, he stood unsteadily, his eyes never leaving hers. When she failed to respond, he spit out horrible words.
"Then you have set yourself higher than the Almighty God, Elizabeth Bennet. He, at least, looks beyond the crime to the circumstances. He is willing to remove even the taint of sin, where you allow nothing."
He stepped closer.
"You are fortunate in having experience with a happy home. Since the death of my parents, I have had none. My young sister has a heart so broken and crushed, I doubt she will ever recover. I have an abundance of properties, but all of them have walls pressing in on me because they are quiet and lonely. I'm chased and hunted and treated like the sum total of my value hangs on what I possess. Not one woman has attempted to see the man behind my name and my bank accounts. Not one. Until you.
He ran his free hand through his hair.
I thought you were different, Elizabeth. I assumed I had found, for the first time, someone I could have easy conversations with. Someone with shared interests, who cares for a sister with the same level of heartfelt feeling as I have for Georgiana. Someone lively, who would make up for where I lack.
He stepped back, his knees hitting the edge of the bed. Her bed.
Pray, accept my apology for poorly sketching your character and for unintentionally causing your reputation harm.
With that said, he felt weak, like the blood had drained from his veins, and his muscles were no longer capable of holding him upright. He sat on the edge of the bed. He finally looked at her, really looked at every inch of her face. He found pain and deep sorrow.
Like her father had done moments before, he had caused her to hurt.
Dropping his chin, his hands hung between his knees, fingers entwined. The carpet on the floor had a dark blue flower where his feet rested. Daylight and night. He sucked in a breath, closed his eyes and shook his head. He could still see the agony and anger on her lovely face.
What will you do?
He had to know she would be well. He had to ask.
Is there a man you admire who would offer you his hand in my stead? If I increased your dowry substantially, would it free him to propose marriage to you?
He gulped.
Is your heart attached to someone else?
He held his breath, fearful of her reply. In his arrogance, he had never considered she might have wished to be someone else's wife. A sharp knife plunged into his gut. This hurt was far worse than the strain on his ankle, or any other injury he had sustained in his lifetime. It was a wound he did not think would ever heal. "There is no one," she whispered. You... She cleared her throat and returned to the chair, folding her hands on her lap after smoothing wrinkles from her skirt. "If I do not marry after the gossip my mother is spreading, I will be shunned. To not bring harm to my sisters, I must leave Longbourn, never to return."
"And this is a better option than marriage to me?"
He was incredulous. She had courage, he had to admit. Foolish courage, but it was there. "You are not the man I thought you to be." Now it was her shaking her head slowly back and forth.
"I do not understand."
And he did not.
What could she possibly mean?
"Your response has taken me by surprise." Her words were hesitant. "I did not think you capable of humility."
"And I did not think you capable of foolishness,"
he responded, though immediately wished he had not spoken aloud. Disguise was his abhorrence. He would hide nothing from her.
"You read Plutarch and Wollstonecraft. These are not the choices of a buffoon."
"Ha ha!" She rolled her eyes as the corner of her mouth lifted. "And you have read these books?"
"Several times, in fact."
He could see her surprise.
"My mother's views on the woman's role in the home were revolutionary, quite different from her peers. My parents would speak of estate matters as we broke our fast each morning, and father consulted her daily, keeping her involved in any aspect of the property where she held interest. I grew to my 12th year observing the very kind of marriage you described. Do I yearn for the same? Absolutely. Have I believed it possible to achieve? Only with you."
Elizabeth leaned closer until he could see each individual eyelash. "Are you suggesting you had considered me as a potential wife before the events of this day?" He wanted to throw his hands up. How could she not have known?
"I am confused, and wonder why you have to ask. Did I not show you particular attention while you stayed at Netherfield Park? I could not look away from you. Certainly you noticed. Even Miss Bingley was aware of my growing attachment. She is not the sharpest quill on the desk, Miss Elizabeth. How could this escape you? How could you not have had some expectation my affections were engaged?" I... She swallowed. She did not look away from him. He marvelled at them both. Each were proud of their own intellect. Neither of them had any clue, apparently, how dim-witted they were when it came to each other. "I have hurt you, then?" She searched his face, possibly looking for blood her words had drawn. "I have judged you harshly, based on my own insecurities, and the comment you made the evening we met about me not being tolerable enough to tempt you." She paused. He felt the heat rising from his chest to his cheeks. How could he have spoken such a lie? "You tempt me." He admitted his feelings with no regard for the consequences. For the first time, he felt she might be seeing him as he was, a simple man with complex responsibilities. She blushed. He was grateful they had matching hues on their faces. "Do you think it best we start over?" she asked. He appreciated her offer. "Please, no." He could not keep the words in. "We have made far too much progress towards getting to know each other these past few minutes to go back and start over again. I would not have you think me callous and cold where you are concerned, as you did before today. Surely you are no longer ignorant of my attachment." "Mr. Darcy, I do not believe ignorant and attachment should be in the same sentence. Possibly they should not even be in the same conversation." He chuckled at her smile. Oh, the relief! He felt like he had marched across France from one end to the other and taken on Napoleon himself, and won. He was not yet the winner of this battle. Neither was Miss Elizabeth. They both bore wounds inflicted by one another. But they would survive to argue another day, it appeared. "I will take your suggestion under consideration and do my best to remedy my error in future conversations," he suggested. She sighed, closing her eyes and resting her head on the back of her chair. He waited, impatiently. He needed to know if there was hope. Suddenly she opened her eyes. Breathing in deeply, Miss Elizabeth bit the corner of her lip. Nodding her head, having come to a conclusion, she finally looked at him. In his mind he was standing before a judge and jury. All of the arguments had been made, witnesses had been called and cross-examined, and his very life hung in the balance of her verdict. She opened her mouth, and he held his breath. "Then we move ahead?" she asked. "Yes, we move ahead." He wanted to jump up and click his heels, a dangerously impossible move with his injury. The bad day was finally getting better by the minute. He hoped. "6. The afternoon turned to evening. Miss Elizabeth, no, she was now more permanently Elizabeth, continued to see to his needs, but never again crossed the threshold of the bedchamber. He caught glimpses of her only as she spoke with Thornton. The bishop had come and gone, balking at the immediacy of the arrangements. Nevertheless, after an enjoyable chess challenge, where Darcy was the victor, a special licence would be available when they arrived at the small chapel attached to Longbourn Estate. By the time of the ceremony, the bishop would personally oversee the marriage service. Fortunately, Mr. Collins had kept himself scarce, which pleased Darcy to no end. His friend Charles Bingley had arrived soon after his injury, but had chosen to spend the majority of his time with the eldest Miss Bennet, rather than pay any attention to his friend. Darcy contemplated the difference between Elizabeth's care of her sister to Bingley's concern for himself. He had to chuckle, startling Thornton from his constant folding and arranging. A tap on the door distracted him. Elizabeth had returned. No, unexpectedly and disappointingly, it was Bingley. Say, old man, you up for a visit?"
Charles's red hair seemed to pop through the doorway long before his face appeared. It reminded Darcy of a toy from his nursery days. The jack-in-the-box had been the object of terror for him, as it was a beastly devil who had popped from the container when the crank was turned. Whenever his nurse had her back to him, he would kick at the toy, hoping it would break. Later, he was pleased it had survived. Georgiana loved the thing. She would giggle and clap her hands the millions of times he had turned the crank, until that ugly monster made its untimely appearance.
"Enter."
Bingley was no devil. He was one of the most amiable of all Darcy's acquaintances. Younger by 4 years, he often begged Darcy's opinion in all matters of life. His latest interest, coincidentally, was love and marriage.
"You devil, you!"
Bingley was grinning from ear to ear as he sat himself in the chair Elizabeth had vacated earlier that day.
"Imagine my surprise when Mrs. Bennet stepped into the parlour to announce your betrothal to Miss Elizabeth. I doubt I've ever seen a woman so completely undone by the prospect. Mrs. Bennet, not your intended. Wait until Caroline hears the news. I only hope I'm there to see her reaction when she realises she's lost out to a Bennet."
He slapped his leg and guffawed. Darcy rolled his eyes.
"Have you not been here all afternoon? Do you truly believe the news has not already arrived at Netherfield Park? Why, I would not be surprised if you returned home to find your sisters have vacated the premises and are on their way to London, so Caroline can find another wealthy man to chase after."
Bingley rubbed his hands together, his face filled with glee.
"Would that not be a fortunate occurrence? We could hunt without having them complain of our absence, and the mud tracked in on the floors. We could visit Longbourn without hearing both Caroline's and Louisa's screeching complaints about the Bennet sisters. We could sit where we want at the dining-room table and put our boots on the seat cushions if we would like."
Bingley sighed.
"Did I mention we could visit Miss Bennet? Oh, my heavens, Darcy, she is an angel."
He sighed again, this time deeper and longer. Darcy spied the glassy look in his friend's eyes, a look he had observed many times in the past. Jane Bennet probably was an angel, worthy of Bingley's devotion. Was Elizabeth an angel? Not hardly. The two sisters were as different as black to white. Darcy knew his own character. He would have been bored within minutes of being alone in Miss Bennet's company. With Elizabeth, her fire lit his tinder. He smiled at the analogy. Bingley must have thought Darcy's grin to be evidence of his agreement with his stated opinion. He continued,
"You agree, then? If my sisters are not gone when I return to Netherfield, we can send them off to London at their earliest convenience. Or mine."
Bingley was forever uncertain when it came to making decisions for his family. Orphaned far too young, he had immediately been pressed under the thumb of his maiden sister. Miss Caroline Bingley's ambitions drove her to outrageous heights of self-importance. She saw herself as a paragon of the first circles and the envy of the rest of the temps. Darcy saw her as offensive and crass.
"Charles,"
he drawled, lengthening his name until Bingley finally had to take note.
"I am to be married in the morning. The last thing I will want to do is spend time with my bride in company with your sisters. My uncle will prevent me from hunting anything other than a good story from a book placed in close proximity, and from putting it up on your furniture. I will be removing from Longbourn its most valuable asset, which will, for the rest of my life, be attached to me. There will be no reason to return to this estate daily after tomorrow." "In the morning?"
Bingley was incredulous.
"I say, Darcy, you work rather quickly for one who is laid up in bed." "Yes, well."
Darcy knew his friend. There was more coming.
"Morning. You will be married in the morning. You will have a wife, will you not? Well, this changes everything."
Bingley sighed, a newly developed unattractive habit.
"Should Caroline and the Hursts leave, I will be alone in that big house as you give all your attention to your new bride. I will need some entertainment,
and doubt I will be as freely welcomed into your bedchamber as I am here today. You're correct. You will not be able to hunt or even come downstairs with that ankle. What was I thinking?" Bingley jumped up, again reminding Darcy of the jack-in-the-box. "I say, Darcy, you would not consider remaining at Longbourn, would you? I would be a diligent visitor. I could bring you whatever items you might need from your chambers at Netherfield. I could run errands. I could walk over, like Miss Elizabeth did when she tended Miss Bennet."
"No, Bingley. Should you come, I pray you ride. Walking is what caused this sequence of events."
You're right as ever." Bingley put his hand to his chin as he paced nervously back and forth at the end of Darcy's bed. "If only it would work out the same for me. Miss Bennet could see to my rescue, and I would be forced to embrace her as she helped me to her bed." At Darcy's raised brows, Bingley recanted.
That did not come out as I had intended."
He waved his hand, fluttering it so it resembled Mrs. Bennet's white handkerchief. Darcy chose not to mention it, as he doubted his friend would appreciate the comparison. Bingley continued. "We would be compromised, and would need to wed the following day." He stopped his infernal pacing and poked his index finger into the air. "I know, Darce. If you could delay your ceremony for 2 days, I could make the hike from my estate to Longbourn on the morrow. I would, to help Miss Bennet along, injure myself much closer to the premises, as I would not want to inconvenience her overmuch."
"She would undoubtedly appreciate your thoughtfulness, Bingley."
He wanted to laugh. "Then Mrs. Bennet will demand we marry, and, thinking ahead, I will have the fee for the licence already in my purse. Yes, we could marry at the same time as you and Miss Elizabeth, should you be willing to wait a day or two." Bingley clapped once, the sound reverberating into the silence. Darcy said nothing, only lifted his left brow, tilting his head slightly. He wanted to smile to himself when he saw it had the same impact on Bingley as when Elizabeth did the same move to him. "I'm being ridiculous, am I not?" Charles asked, his shoulders drooping and his hands falling to his sides. "I have yet to determine Miss Bennet's interest in me in relation to my interest in her. Also, I am not much of a walker. Most likely I would collapse within sight of Netherfield's main house, where the servants would drag me to my bed, and my sisters would be forced to tend me." He dropped back into the chair. Best laid plans, Darce."
"I'm sorry you're disappointed, Bingley. You should get points for inventiveness and enthusiasm, I believe."
"I somehow doubt either of those would impress Miss Bennet."
"Are you sure?"
he had to ask. Jane Bennet was so quiet that it was impossible to sketch her character. He chuckled to himself. Elizabeth Bennet was most decidedly not quiet, yet he had not been able to sketch her character as well. Possibly he needed to stop trying and focus on something else, something like how to be romantic.
Ladies want romance, do they not? "Say, Bingley,"
Darcy choked out the words.
"You've had some success with... Oh, Lord."
He was sweating under his nightshirt.
"With women. In addition, you have sisters, one who is already wed."
He cleared his throat, trying to dislodge the large goose egg stuck in the region of his Adam's apple. "Some success, I agree. Women seem to like me." Bingley nodded his head hesitantly.
"Yes, well, I was wondering what you would do to impress Miss Bennet with your romantic nature."
He finally got to the crux of the matter. "You think I have a romantic nature? Why? How kind of you, Darcy. I was not aware you'd noticed." Darcy shook his head briskly. He now felt foolish and embarrassed for bringing up the subject. Far be it for him to expect a reasonable response from the ever-vacillating Bingley. "Well, old man, to answer your question, I would start with flowers." Bingley warmed to the subject. I would pick the largest bouquet of pretty flowers the garden had to offer. Any lady would sincerely appreciate my personal effort for this task, I'm sure."
"Bingley, it is November. There are no flowers in the garden."
Darcy, ever the pessimist, pointed out the obvious. The ground had been covered in morning frost for the last several weeks, leaving behind wilted greens and stalks with no buds or pretty petals. Undaunted, Bingley added, "Poetry. I would ask you for suggestions. Borrow one of your books. Wrap it. Or rather, have it wrapped in pretty paper with a lovely bow on top she could use in her hair later. The perfect gift." Darcy considered. "Thornton, I need a book, paper, and a bow." "Very good. What colour, sir?" his valet questioned. "Red," Darcy suggested. "Pink," Bingley answered at the same time. Darcy considered the recipient of the gift. While Miss Jane Bennet was all soft colours and gentleness, his Elizabeth was alive and spirited. Red would do. "Which book, Mr. Darcy?" Thornton kept track of each item packed when Darcy travelled. He knew the titles of every book his master carried with him each time he left Pemberley or Darcy House. "Possibly Shakespeare's sonnets." Sonnet 18 was one of his favourites. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" How well that described Elizabeth. "Yes, that volume will work well," he determined, only to watch Thornton move his eyes to the nightstand next to the bed. Darcy wanted to smack himself in the forehead. There was Elizabeth's own copy, between Plutarch and Wollstonecraft. Now it was he who sighed. "Might I offer a suggestion, sir?" Thornton asked. "You might want to speak to Miss Bennet. She's closest to her sister, and would know which poems are our favourite. You only have an hour until dinner will be brought up, so time should not be wasted suggesting and rejecting ideas." "Excellent point, Thornton." He looked at Bingley. "Would you mind?" He tilted his head to the door. "Mind what?" Charles immediately responded, then blushed an unmanly shade of pink. "Oh, yes, I will inquire if Miss Bennet is available." Jumping up, he hastily departed the room. "I desire to proceed in a manner which will be pleasurable to the future Mrs. Darcy from now on, Thornton. Neither you nor I have experience with attracting and keeping the affections of a woman, and I feel a bit like a blindfolded man trying to find a needle amidst a stable full of straw," he mused. "With that said, I am fiercely determined my wife will not regret marriage to me." "Which is as it should be, sir." "7. Mrs. Bennet felt it was a slight against her person that the ceremony would take place without the typical celebrations. There had been no time to parade her daughter through the neighbourhood, so she could be feted with congratulations and enlightened as to the marital responsibilities by knowing matrons. She succinctly outlined to Darcy each loss she suffered, as mother of the bride, by the rapidity of the marriage. Darcy had asked her how he could make the sorry situation up to her. "You can throw my other daughters in front of other rich men, sir," had been her vulgar reply. Had his new mother-in-law known how disappointed he was, as well, she might have been ashamed at her complaining spirit. Or not. Never had he dreamed he would stand in the front of the chapel, waiting for a hesitant bride, while leaning on a crutch hastily fashioned by local carpenters. Determined to proceed on his own, by the time he had bathed, dressed, hobbled down the hallway, and cautiously navigated the stairs, he had rivulets of sweat dripping from his temple, his underarms, and down his back. His palm was sore from gripping the wood, and his good leg felt like it would give out at any moment. The fabric under his arm had bunched up, so his jacket fit crookedly. He was afraid to right himself. He would not be married from the stone floor, where he would have landed had he lost his balance. It would not have helped his reputation in Meryton society. Mrs. Bennet was persistent. "One daughter married and another on her way," she repeated to anyone who would listen, which consisted of her husband and children, Mr. Collins, their neighbours, the Lucas family, and Bingley and his sisters. Bingley's brother-in-law had remained at Netherfield Park. The size of the gathering had been another one of her complaints. Apparently, she had hoped for the whole of the community to offer their joy. Whether it was for the actual marriage, or her portion in making it happen, Darcy had no way of knowing. When Elizabeth had appeared in the doorway, her hand on her father's arm, he forgot his pain, and he no longer heard the mutterings of Mrs. Bennet. She took his breath away. Later, he could not have told anyone the colour of her dress, or of the silk ribbons on her bonnet. Light pouring through the church windows bathed her face, giving her an angelic glow. Her eyes shone, and he could not look away. Was it magic? Had she bewitched him? He swallowed to make sure his tongue was not hanging out of his mouth. He had never seen such a beautiful woman, and his heart was ready to burst that she would soon be his to take to his home. When Mr. Bennet placed her small hand in his, he felt her gentle squeeze. Closing his eyes for a moment, a picture flashed before him of a willing, happy Elizabeth standing next to a perfectly healthy groom. Reality hit him squarely in the face when he unintentionally started to lean towards where Bingley was standing. Elizabeth tightened her grip and pulled him upright. "I thank you," he whispered. She smiled. His heart soared. The ceremony began. He promised. She did as well, though she grinned impishly when reciting the vow to obey. Psalms were read, communion taken, prayers offered. Married. He sighed, as did Bingley. He had made it through the hour it took for the service, and wondered if the bishop was taking personal delight in his discomfort. Surely a man of the cloth would be above seeking vengeance for interfering with his schedule. He glanced at Mr. Collins sitting in the pew with his arms folded across his chest, and a sour look on his face, and found his answer. They were imperfect humans too. Kindly, Elizabeth took his good arm and helped him walk to where they would sign the register. She moved to his right side to bolster him, while he sloppily penned his name. He wanted to sit down. He wanted to be back in Elizabeth's bed, with his ankle propped up on a stack of pillows. He wanted her with him. Good heavens! How could such an innocent desire cause— Well, he was still in the chapel. He would think on all things holy. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Was that it? No, he had forgotten Leviticus. Phew. He was married, but he had no right to think like a married man until they were alone, together. Later, much later. He sighed again. Mrs. Bennet and her plans. Mr. Darcy. His wife sought his attention. Elizabeth, we are married. You are free to call me by my given name. Her being formal with him was not a good start. It was starting to weigh on him, until she giggled softly. I would be pleased to do so, sir, yet I cannot. Cannot? He was puzzled. Why not? Because I do not know exactly what to call you. She stood close to him. She was a distraction. Lavender. Is Fitzwilliam the name you are called by your family? An easy question. No, my mother's family name is Fitzwilliam, so it was entirely too confusing to keep the name when we were together. He smiled at the memory of his childhood. Since I was very young, I have been called William. I would hope you would do the same. William. She tried the name, and it rolled easily off her tongue. He broke out in another sweat, thinking about that particular appendage. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts of the Apostles. Are you well, husband? She innocently asked. As well as can be expected, I believe. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. William, the carriage is outside the door. Might you feel more comfortable being seated? He wanted to hug her tight. Other than Thornton, who received a generous salary for doing so, no one saw to his needs. No one looked after his comfort. Joy filled his soul.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I would appreciate the relief.
Excusing themselves, they settled into the squabs after Thornton and Bingley aided him inelegantly up the steps. Yesterday's conveyance would have been much easier, but far less dignified. He would not take his bride to their wedding night in a pony cart. The wedding night. Could he not think of anything else? He had waited almost 28 years, and he had the loveliest wife a man could possibly want. Why should he not think of the hours ahead? Then the full extent of their circumstances hit him. He could not walk on his own. He was in pain from his thigh to his toes. Any slight movement hurt. Even the weight of the bedclothes was too much. He wanted to growl. Had it been manly, he would have sobbed. Oh, Lord! What was she expecting? No doubt what every other bride anticipated or dreaded. Had her mother spoken to her? He wanted to roll his eyes at imagining the conversation. His wife, mortified, and his mother-in-law smirking at what was to come. Oh! William, I believe we need to have some conversation. It would not do to be silent the 3 miles to Netherfield Park. Are you nervous? He had not meant to be blunt. Yes. Of? He was compelled to ask. Of almost everything, to be honest. She looked at him directly, refusing to shy away from a topic she had likely never spoken of to a man. Would you mind if we stopped at Longbourn for tea? He queried. Are you certain? Her brow was wrinkled, and her head cocked to the side. He had puzzled her, but he was now set in his course. I am. Tapping on the roof of the carriage, they stopped. Giving directions to the coachman, they turned into the long driveway leading to her former home. He could almost hear Mrs. Bennet screeching from the carriage behind them. She had demanded the wedding breakfast be held at Netherfield Park, the stateliest home in the shire. Darcy had declined, not wanting to place such a burden on Bingley's staff, but she refused to listen. In addition, he had wanted to be free of the other residents of Longbourn since before he had arrived the day prior. He had wanted away from the company of Elizabeth's family. Mrs. Bennet would have to live with the disappointment. They would not be staying at Longbourn, nor attending the breakfast. Mrs. Darcy. He liked the sound of her new name. Mrs. Darcy. Mrs. Darcy. Mrs. Darcy. He said it with emphasis on the different syllables, and decided he liked the way it sounded, no matter how it was pronounced. Yes, Mr. Darcy, she teased. I quite like your new name, Elizabeth. He tried not to grin, and failed spectacularly. Pray forgive me in advance if I overuse it, until I get used to hearing it spoken aloud. You are forgiven. She laughed aloud. Only the day before he had accused her of failing to absolve him from his errors. Today she was quick in her response. Now please share with me your reasoning for calling at my home. You see, Elizabeth, that is exactly the problem. Longbourn is officially no longer your home. Netherfield Park is home to neither of us as well. While we are in Hertfordshire, we are essentially homeless. I see. It seems we do have a problem. She tapped her finger to her chin. What are you suggesting we do to resolve this issue? Do we drug you so you can make the journey to Derbyshire, so we can spend our first night together in your home? Our home, my bride. Fine then, our home. She again tapped her finger. With Pemberley being several days' travel from Meryton, even if we departed immediately, rather than wait for tea to be served, we still would not be spending tonight in our home. I have married a wise woman, Elizabeth Darcy. The carriage stopped. If you would keep me company, I suggest we stay where we are to enjoy our tea in the privacy of this conveyance, whereupon I can be liberally doused with laudanum, so I sleep away the pain while we travel to Darcy House in London. Then we will be in our home before dark. Darcy House it will be for Mr. and Mrs. Darcy. I find your plan to be sound, she quickly agreed. Pray remain seated while I make arrangements. She did not sound nervous. In fact, she seemed far more agreeable to his suggestion than he had imagined. He had married a reasonable woman. He wanted to celebrate. He wanted to make the trip as fast as possible. He wanted his ankle to be sound and pain-free. And he wanted his wife, with a passion so fierce it shocked him to the core. In due time. Frustrated, he set things in motion. Thornton plied him with the drug, after making him as comfortable as possible. Elizabeth sent a note by express to the Darcy House staff to prepare for the master and his new wife's arrival that evening. Mr. Bennet walked into Longbourn and chose not to look back. Mr. Collins stood outside the carriage window and wrung his hands, muttering. Elizabeth's sisters, especially Jane, wished them well, then moved into the house to get out of the chill. The couple raced off to town before Mrs. Bennet could remove her bonnet. Thornton would see to the collection of his possessions from both residences in Hertfordshire, and then hasten to London in the servants' carriage to see everyone settled. In the meantime, Elizabeth was in charge. With that last thought, and what was probably a silly-looking smile on his face, Darcy slept. The trip was made with minimum discomfort to him. He did not wake until hours later, when he was ensconced in the master's chambers, with pillows tucked in the appropriate places. Had that been him snoring? Certainly not. Looking around, he was disappointed to find he was alone. Where was his wife? Was she pleased with her new home? Did she find her new chambers to be a place she would want to reside? Did she like him yet? (8) Darcy woke the next morning ready to rally the troops. Elizabeth first needed a tour of their residence, with an eye to updating any of the furnishings, should she desire. A modiste would be summoned to provide the new mistress of Pemberley and Darcy House with a complete wardrobe, something appropriate for her new position in society. Jewellery boxes needed removing from the safe to study each piece to see if it appealed to Elizabeth or not. The Darcy family jeweller could be called to have the pieces she rejected redesigned or reset. Nothing was too much work for his bride. Notices would need to be sent to the circulating papers, and letters needed to be written to his family to inform them of his marriage. He had much to do on this first morning of having a wife. Nonetheless, his first task was to safely get out of bed. He still had a bit of a fog left over from the laudanum. Before he could extricate himself, someone tapped on his outer door. Elizabeth? He was intensely disappointed to find it was his housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond. "You asked to see me, Mr. Darcy?" "I did." Perhaps he had issued the instructions the night before. The housekeeper was a no-nonsense woman who ran his Darcy house efficiently. She could be kind when needed, but brooked no laziness in any member of the staff, including herself. "I did." He had no reason not to agree. It was time to put his plans into action. "Pray return in a half-hour, Mrs. Drummond. We have much to discuss." While Thornton attended to him, he inquired as to the staff's initial impression of the new mistress. His valet, as was typical, had much to share. "Molly was assigned to assist her last evening, and this morning she reported how your wife offered sincere comments of appreciation when each task was done. Cook was pleased to receive a kind word about the tastiness of the creamed peas, and Mrs. Drummond's nerves have settled, and she is ready to proceed with any instruction Mrs. Darcy might have." "Has Mrs. Darcy broken her fast?" He hated to admit he had no clue where his wife was. If she was still lying in her bed next door, tucked under the covers, enjoying the space of her new bed. It was made for two, not like the one he slept in at Longbourn. Her bed. Lavender. "Yes, she was downstairs early, and is now in the library, seated before the fire with a stack of books on the table and a cup of fresh tea in her hands." Thornton smiled, and Darcy was happy to see him pleased. "Mrs. Darcy was offered a tour of the house, but has decided to wait until you are up and around.
She asked only about the reading room and the music salon."
He nodded. How like his Elizabeth.
"Mrs. Drummond did as you requested, sir, and explained to Mrs. Darcy that she had complete oversight of the premises. She offered to review the accounts and give her the keys to the linen cupboards."
Again the valet smiled.
"She politely declined for the moment, saying she wanted to settle in first and that your health was her first priority."
Thornton dropped his voice almost to a whisper.
"I was most happy to hear this, sir, though it was not unexpected."
Darcy nodded, delighted with the report. When Mrs. Drummond returned, orders were given for a modiste. He was surprised to find he had already given instructions soon after their arrival. It seems that even in a daze, Darcy managed his household well. Georgiana's dressmaker would be at Darcy House within the hour.
"Master William,"
Mrs. Drummond addressed him as she always had,
"I am as pleased as Punch with the mistress, and know I am overreaching by reporting a private conversation to you. But in my delight I cannot keep silent." "What is this?"
He was curious. His housekeeper had never before commented on personal matters of the family, so this was highly out of character.
"When I did as you asked, and offered to deliver the jewel boxes to Mrs. Darcy's sitting room for her to survey all she now owned, she declined. It was then that she asked about the library."
Mrs. Drummond practically bounced in her pleasure.
"Your dearly departed mother, Lady Anne, would be pleased that you made a love match, sir. Of that I have no doubt."
The housekeeper had served under the authority of his mother for years, and had known her well. Darcy smiled, and laid back against the headboard, where Thornton had put him when he woke. Suddenly, Darcy was excited. He anticipated a new beginning with his wife, where he could reveal all they would share.
Wait until she saw the library at Pemberley, and the multitude of walking trails. She would love the gazebo to the east, set at the edge of a lake, where she could take a book and a picnic while she enjoyed the afternoon breeze.
He would lay it all out for her to relish. Imagining her joy at learning what her life was to be, he could not contain his own happiness. He felt full of relief. They would be happy. She would love him as much as he loved her. He loved her. Yes, he loved her. Contentment filled him, chasing out all fear of having his heart exposed to harm, should she continue to not return his affections. He would love her enough for the both of them, until she caught up. Until then, he would be the gentleman his parents raised him to be, someone she would long to spend time with, to enjoy companionship with, and to learn to cherish. His smile was unrestrained. Disturbing his pleasurable thoughts, the front door suddenly slammed back until it hit the wall, and a voice of doom yelled so loudly he could hear each individual word, which was no mean feat, with the distance the sound had to travel to reach his ears.
"Where is my nephew? And where is the trollop he married?"
Lady Catherine de Bourgh had arrived. He wanted to throw something, preferably his fist. Blushing at his disrespect for his mother's sister, he stood with the help of the crutch and his valet. Manipulating his way to the doorway, he started down the long hall, cursing his slowness with each painful step. Elizabeth had reached Lady Catherine first. "I understand you are from Kent," he heard Elizabeth ask. Whatever she had intended to say next was rudely cut off by his aunt.
"I know where I am from, you impertinent girl. I demand to see my nephew. Where is he?"
His aunt was in fine fettle. Before he could shout a response, his wife answered, much more calmly than he had intended. "Lady Catherine, you may be aunt to my husband, but this is my home. Your making demands is highly inappropriate and unwelcomed." Elizabeth kept her tone soft. He heard his aunt start to interrupt. Elizabeth continued. "You may make all the demands you feel you deserve, and you may stand out here at your leisure, or you can be welcome to Darcy House as the guest you could be. As I see it, Lady Catherine, you have two choices. Remain here and shout, or allow the staff to see to your comfort. Your outer clothes will be gathered. You can follow Mrs. Drummond into the drawing-room, where you can warm yourself by the fire and enjoy refreshments with me, while we discuss this situation in a refined manner. The choice is entirely up to you." He hurried as fast as he could, frustration mixing with his ire. His responsibility was to protect his household and his wife from harm. He felt powerless and useless. Finally giving in, he dropped the crutch to the ground and bore the pain. Moving much quicker, he arrived at the top of the stairs in time to hear, "I will not be spoken to in such a manner in my sister's home." Lady Catherine insisted. "Do you know who I am? I am the daughter of an earl, the sister of one of the most superior women who ever walked on this earth, and the mother of a child perfectly formed to be the mistress of this household. Who are you? Who is your mother? Who are your people? Can you claim a superiority of birth to justify attempting to coerce me to your bidding? I ask you again, who are you?" With each word, his aunt had inched closer to Elizabeth. His wife stood her ground. In fact, she leaned closer as soon as Lady Catherine finished her offensive cross-examination. He watched in awe, impressed with her bravery. His wife was younger, smaller, and had far less experience with confrontation from someone with strong opinions like his aunt. He was proud of her. Grabbing the banister, Darcy descended as quickly as his ankle would allow. By the time he got to the bottom, he was hopping on one foot and hopping mad at the same time. Before he could open his mouth, his wife spoke. "Lady Catherine, poor manners will not be tolerated in our home, not by you, and not by anyone related to me. Your nephew chose me to be his wife, long before he asked for my hand. Who are you to question his judgment?" Elizabeth pointed her finger at Lady Catherine's chest, her voice still sounding serene. "You stated one fact I agree with." Elizabeth stopped speaking, leaving the thought in mid-air. Even he wondered which portion of his aunt's tirade she considered truthful. Lady Catherine waited. Then she waited some more, her irritation increasing with each passing swing of the grand clock pendulum. Finally, she could stand it no longer. "Out with it!" she demanded, her head thrown back and her nose elevated as high as her opinions. "What fact could we ever have in common? You are a simple girl, one who used her arts and allurements to capture Darcy. Your mercenary nature has been told me in minute detail by my own rector. He shared how you abandoned your interest in him as soon as a wealthier man came into the shire. You do not deserve to live in this home. You do not deserve to enter through the front doorway. You have done nothing to earn a place in this household and in the Fitzwilliam family." "Well, that is a shame, Lady Catherine." Elizabeth shook her head. Darcy wondered what she was up to. She was not intimidated by his aunt's outrageous lies. She stood her ground, and he finally stood right beside her. She turned to him. "William, your aunt and I were speaking of your mother." She grabbed his upper arm and stepped closer to him so he could lean against her. "Pray let us move into the drawing-room so you may rest your injured leg. The trip from your chambers to here must have been exceedingly painful." She smiled at him, ignoring his aunt. He wanted to embrace her or applaud. "Come, let us see to your comfort, husband." Leaving his aunt standing in the entrance hall, with her mouth hung open, was priceless. She sputtered, she hissed like an old barn cat, but no words left her mouth. When they reached the drawing-room, Elizabeth looked back. "Lady Catherine, are you coming or not?" His wife's left brow lifted, and he was enchanted. How could she do that? Take him from explosive anger to pleasure? "What?" The question burst from his aunt. "You were hoping to tell me of Lady Anne, were you not? I would love to hear about such a superior woman, and think to know my husband better by hearing of the woman responsible for his birth and the development of his character. Elizabeth waited. Lady Catherine followed. Darcy would have bet his fortune on her not doing so, and he would have lost. (9) By the time Lady Catherine was finally shown the door, several hours had passed. Elizabeth had kept her dignity the whole time. Lady Catherine? He sighed. There had been a few instances where he thought he would have to step between her and Elizabeth to protect his wife. However, his aunt was not immune to good manners and an uplifted eyebrow. They did not part as friends, but he doubted Lady Catherine would try to abuse his wife again.
Elizabeth, I find it difficult to comprehend what happened in our own home.
He leaned closer to her, being thrilled she had placed herself at his side when they were first seated.
What did happen here?
He did not expect her mirth. Do you not know? Can you not see the similarities? Elizabeth asked. When he shook his head stupidly, she continued. What drives your aunt is fear. Fear of change. Fear of losing her place in society. Fear for her daughter's future. Does this not sound familiar?
Your mother?
Yes, my mother. Elizabeth did not pull away when he moved closer, so he tried it again. There is no sense shouting back, because they cannot hear beyond the turmoil in their own minds. There is no sense getting angry, because a certain amount of their concerns are based on truth. Your aunt is much older than my mother. She must worry about dying and leaving your cousin alone, unprotected. She must worry about her name being forgotten when other family members start having children and growing families of their own, making it almost impossible for her to be involved in their lives. Yes, I noted too many similarities to ignore. Therefore I treated her like I do my mother, and she responded the same.
Well, I am amazed.
He moved his hand to hers and clasped her fingers in his. Again she did not pull away, so he entwined his fingers with her own. They were palm to palm. Why that made his breathing hitch, he thought he knew, though he did not feel it was the proper hour to pursue the topic.
And I am proud, Mrs. Darcy.
Did I prove my worth, sir? Am I to be rewarded for my good behaviour with closets of new clothes, heaps of diamonds and pearls, new carriages, and your 10,000 a year? He loved that she could laugh at him. He loved her. Taking a chance, he moved ever closer, tilting his head as she responded by tilting her own. Her lips were full and lush, red where she had teased the corner of the bottom with her teeth. Oh, what it did to him when she bit her lip. He vowed then and there that he would kiss that bottom lip every time she bit it. He moved closer until he could feel her breath on his chin, closer until he could almost touch her, closer still. "Ee-aw! Ee-aw!" Instead of Elizabeth's mouth being gently pressed against his, a cold, wet donkey tongue slathered him with saliva from his chin, up his left cheek, and into his dark, curly hair, knocking his hat off.
What?
Darcy looked around. Instead of being cosied up in his drawing-room at Darcy House in London, he was in the pasture, leaning up against a boulder, with Longbourn in his sights.
Oh, stop!
He pushed against the animal's muzzle to get Benedict to move away from him. The stubborn animal had no intentions of moving. Darcy wanted to lash out at the four-legged creature, but knew how self-protective donkeys were. The throbbing in his ankle inside his boot rapidly informed him he was injured. Reaching behind his head, he found the large knot at the bottom of his skull. He must have hit the rock on his way down. Darcy looked up at the sky as his hand moved of its own accord to Benedict's nose. He scratched, then pushed the donkey's head away
when its mouth opened and his tongue reappeared. Yuck!
Darcy tilted his head and wiped the side of his face on the sleeve of his coat. The fabric was dry. It had not yet rained. Darcy looked up at the clouds covering the muted sunlight and had no idea how long he had been in the field. What he did know was that he needed to seek assistance, and that everything that had occurred had resulted from his own imagination, not reality. He sighed. What a shame. He had not compromised Elizabeth. No, she was Miss Elizabeth. He had already met Mr. Collins, so that occurrence was also untrue. Darcy pulled at a blade of grass and crushed it in his hand. He was not married. More specifically, he was not married to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. His heart hurt. He scoffed. He should be grateful. He should be rejoicing at not being tied to her ridiculous mother and sisters, and her indifferent father, who would keep such an animal, most likely for entertainment. But he was not grateful, and he certainly was not rejoicing. What do you think, Benedick? He rubbed the donkey's nose again. Is Elizabeth the Beatrice to my Benedick? Hearing his name, the donkey whinnied. Not you, me. Whimsically, he thought about the characters in Shakespeare's play, and compared them with his current circumstance. Both Beatrice and Benedick claimed to have no interest in the other. They worked hard to leave the impression that they were not the least bit interested, and vowed never to marry, especially each other. Yet by the end of the play, they had found their happily ever after. Would the same happen with him and Elizabeth? She hated him. She would never consider marriage to him. He rubbed his hand over his face. Unfortunately, his words at the Meryton Assembly had been uttered, apparently within her hearing. Recalling their conversations while she cared for Miss Bennet at Netherfield Park, he now realised she had never taken the initiative to speak with him. He was the one who had to work at finding a topic to share. He was the one who had asked her to dance. Twice. She had refused him both times. He sucked in his breath. What had he done to recommend himself to her family, to her friends? Darcy pondered his attitude and actions since his arrival in Hertfordshire 6 weeks prior. He had been a stubborn ass, just as much as Mr. Bennet's donkey. He scratched behind Benedick's ears when the donkey lowered its head to eat from the slippery tufts of grass which had been responsible for his fall. We are much alike, you and I. The donkey snorted. Darcy wanted to do the same. No, it is true. Thinking of the events to come, and possible opportunities he could use to repair his reputation with Meryton society, he remembered Bingley's ball. The day was Tuesday. The Netherfield ball would be held on Tuesday next. He had one se'nnight to make needed adjustments to his attitude. He had not admired himself for most of the time he was in his dream state, but that could change. It would change. A portion of his delusional fantasy was the tree limb he had used as a crutch. He gazed around the field. Nothing. Oh, good Lord. He wanted to slap himself or bang his head back on the rock. He had a donkey right in front of him who appeared to be unafraid of him, and who apparently liked the shaving soap his valet used. Benedick, it is to be you and me, then. Pressing his gloves into the soft soil, he attempted to wedge his good leg underneath him, with no success. Putting his hands behind him, he tried to use the rough edges of the boulder to push himself upright. That did not work either. Humiliated to the core, he did the only thing left. He rolled to his side until he could lift himself onto his hands and knees. He knew Benedick would laugh, if he could, at having a human in a similar stance to his own. Fortunately, there was no loud braying to draw attention to his indignity. While still poised on his hands and knees, he heard her. Mr. Darcy, I can see you are unwell. Pray, allow me to return to Longbourn for aid. He groaned aloud, the pain in his ankle vying with the degradation. Sir, Miss Elizabeth moved closer. "If I help you stand, would you be able to ride Benedick as far as Longbourn?" In that split second, Darcy had a decision. Would he let things be, and hope their journey towards their future brought them together in the same manner as his dreams? Or was it more prudent to begin now to forge a new path? He decided on the latter.
"Miss Elizabeth, your appearance is timely, and I appreciate it sincerely."
He saw only concern on her face, no mockery, no teasing.
"I could do with some assistance."
With no small amount of effort he stood. He could not have done so without her help, and he told her so. She looked around. "Benedick, come!" The donkey ignored her, as donkeys do. Then she did something so amazingly wonderful he could not take his eyes off her. She curled her tongue to the roof of her mouth and emitted the loudest whistle he had ever heard. Not only did it catch his attention, it did Benedick's as well.
"Miss Elizabeth, you have proven you are indeed an accomplished woman."
She smiled at him, and he was stunned to realize it was the first time she had done so. "Do you think so, Mr. Darcy? Would not Miss Bingley need to be informed so she could add it to her list of what constitutes an accomplished woman?" Shared laughter is the most joyous. The donkey stood still while Miss Elizabeth scratched behind its ears. Darcy was able to mount after no little amount of struggle. Still, all of the pressure was off his foot, and the relief was immense.
"I will confess, Miss Elizabeth, to a certain level of jealousy."
At her raised brow he continued.
"My mother could whistle so loud that my male cousins and I would hear it when we were at the far reaches of Pemberley, playing in the ponds and streams. We always knew to come running."
He shrugged his shoulders.
"We practised for hours, day after day, from one end of the summer to the other, and none of us ever came close. I am impressed."
She laughed. "I suppose it is a particular sort of accomplishment."
"Whoa!"
He stopped the animal. Miss Elizabeth turned to look at him. "Sir?" He could see the concern on her face. "Are you not well enough to continue? The clouds look like rain." He looked up.
Yes, she was correct.
Then he peered back at her.
"When I was 8 years old, I vowed I would marry the first female who could whistle like my mother."
He snickered.
"My cousins and parents always knew how important it was for me to keep my word, to be honourable to a promise. So you might imagine how my father dreaded the arrival of each new milkmaid, as they often called the cows to the barn with a whistle."
She grinned.
20 years have passed since I made that vow."
He reached down and covered her hand where it rested on the donkey's mane.
"I will not ask you now to be my bride, as I suspect you would refuse me, and rightly so."
She nodded. Her eyes looked directly into his soul.
"I am ashamed to admit that I have not presented myself as I truly am while in Hertfordshire. Therefore," he gulped, "I beg for the honour of a courtship to get to know one another better. My intentions are honourable. My hope is that, in time, you will be my bride."
She looked down to where his hand rested on hers. He waited.
Impatiently.
Looking back up at him, she spoke. "You are correct, Mr. Darcy. I do not like you, and had suspected you did not like me as well." Then her words became magical. "However, Benedick likes you, and that says far more about your character than I have discerned since we met. And Mr. Bingley likes you. That tells me you may have hidden facets worth exploring."
He liked having hidden facets.
He could not keep the smile off his face. "Pray stop, Mr. Darcy." Her smile grew. "Dimples are so unfair."
"I will use what I have, Miss Elizabeth."
He became serious.
"May I speak to your father?"
He thought of the Mr. Bennet from his dream, and wondered at the reality.
He supposed he would find out.
Yes, Mr. Darcy. She threw back her head and laughed. Benedict joined in, by braying loudly enough to drown out the musical quality of her sounds. Tell my father what a fine animal you are riding, and you will have a friend for life.
And what would it take to have you as a friend for life? He had to ask.
She looked him directly in the eye, lifted her brow, and gave him the key to happiness. Why, Mr. Darcy, do you not already know? Tilting her head to the side, she smiled softly, her eyes luminous. You walk beside me when I walk. You listen to me when I listen to you. And, sir, you fill your days, not with badness, but with joy. He returned her smile. Rain started to fall, pounding in time with the ache in his ankle. He could not have cared less. The day which had started badly was now the happiest in his life. Tapping Benedict on his side with his good leg, he entwined his fingers with hers, and they started their walk to Longbourn. Epilogue. 14 months later. Mrs. Elizabeth Darcy was having a bad day. Her feet were swollen, her face was puffy, her stomach was as big as Pemberley's main house, and her lower back ached fiercely. She glared at the man walking alongside her. He had restricted her strolls to the vicinity of their home, and though she appreciated his care and wisdom, it was not what she had wanted to hear when she first announced her intent. She was grumpy, she was growly, she wanted to throw something or hit someone, and she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt who would be the target. Oh yes, she was having a bad day, and it was all Fitzwilliam Darcy's fault. This has been Mr. Darcy's Bad Day, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Copyright 2017 by Quiet Mountain Press, LLC. Production copyright 2017 by Quiet Mountain Press, LLC.